Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another online teaching session. I personally think this is one of the important sessions and one of the important topics we're going to be discussing today. We all know that how much involved we are, especially with the neonatal units uh, for various embryological disorders in newborns, which is very common. And I have to agree that this is one of the probably the least read and discuss topics in various fora. So I think I should thank Dr. Dharani to volunteer and also pick this topic, which is very, very relevant. So before we start, I just want to introduce our, fact for today. First of all, thank you, Dharani, who basically accepted to do this topic today. And Dharani is a consultant at Sri Ramachandra Institute of Higher Education and Research at Chennai. Thank you, Dharani. We also have Dr. Revati Raj. She doesn't need an introduction. Ma'am is a senior consultant and head of pediatric hematology oncology at Apollo Chennai. We have Siddharth Totadri, who is basically assistant professor at CMC Vellore. And we have a guest faculty today, Dr. Uma Maheshwari, who is associate professor in the Department of Neonatology at the Sri Ramachandra Research Center. So special welcome to you, Dr. Uma, for sparing your time and participating in this discussion today. And Dr. Balaji is a fellow, I think, at SRMC, and he is going to be presenting today's case. So as usual, thanks to Echo and Ria, and also my curriculum committee who puts these programs together. Over to you, Dharani. So we'll have the same format. I think Siddharth is going to be present the didactic today, and then we'll have the case discussion. So please feel to ask right in the chat box and ask questions, which the experts will be answering during the course of the discussion today. Over to you, Dharani. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for the opportunity. As you said, it's really a difficult and a very common topic as well. So, and it's very important that we discuss this. And thank you for the opportunity. So, we've introduced the speakers. I just would like to give an overview regarding why we are discussing this topic today. So, as we know, the developmental erythropoiesis, which is a transition from fetal to neonatal to infant to child to adult transition, it's a dynamic process. Sometimes it happens, things happen over days or a few weeks or even months. So it's very important we understand this. As we see here, everything is dynamic. The RBCs, which are larger at birth, reaches, the adult value slowly by 1 year of age. And the neonatal RBCs are less deformable. They are more susceptible to oxidant damage because the enzymes are not very mature, and the higher proportions of acanthocyte target cells are seen, which needs to be understood and interpreted. They are more osmotically resistant, and the RBC antigens develop over time in the due course of time. With this in background, so the increased variability of the smear with multiple morphologic changes have to be interpreted. And we know that the membrane pits happen because of the poor splenic function. The HbF is more resistant to acid denaturation. It has more affinity to oxygen, and the lifespan by itself is reduced in neonates, even in a term neonate of 60 to 90 days, and the preterm even less compared to a child or adult who has 90 to 120 days. So the concept of physiologic anemia again has to be understood, which is the anemia, the decline in hemoglobin, which happens after birth until the erythropoiesis of the infant kicks up, which happens normally. Often this anemia is asymptomatic, hence we call it as physiologic anemia. Again, it varies in terms and preterm babies. The Nader value and the duration is different. So this understanding is very important. With this, I thank all the panelists to agree to participate in this, and I hand over to Dr. Siddharth to present his didactic session on approach to anemia in youth. Over to Dr.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dharani, for this opportunity to present this didactic session on anemia in newborns. Next slide. Yeah, so I just wanted to start by saying that usually when we do newborn, when we do neonatology in our MD, we tend to think there is a very limited set of differential diagnosis in neonatology, just like NEC and preterm babies, respiratory distress syndrome, just some 4-5 diagnoses. But when it comes to neonatal hematology, there's just a whole universe of differential diagnosis. So next slide. Next slide. Is there some way I can control the presentation?
Sir, are you sharing it or is it Dharani?
Who's sharing
From
this?
Darren's.
Then Dharani has to move it. Otherwise,
Yeah, can you change this? When I say next, can you just go to the next slide, Dharani?
Dharani doesn't seem to be there on the screen. Siddharth, you have the presentation with you?
Yeah, I'll just.
If you can, but we have to ask Dharani to stop sharing. Otherwise, you cannot.
I can stop the sharing, sir.
You can stop the sharing and let Siddharth present from his computer.
Sure.
So I am not sure where do I share my screen.
Sir, apparently I checked with Dr. Tarani. She says that she got disconnected.
Oh, okay.
I think she's kind of coming back again.
Siddharth, you
some
start from your
reason-
computer.
Yeah, where's the icon to share the screen? Sorry, yeah, I think I got it. Yeah, I
Green,
got it.
green button.
Green button.
Yeah, I think I got it.
Just to make us close.
Yeah. Is it visible?
Yeah, so just do that enable editing, click on that,
Yeah.
and then you
So-
can do
So
the,
my slide is visible, right? I'll go ahead.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
You
yeah,
can
sorry.
change to slideshow.
Yeah, it is on slideshow mode in my screen.
No, you have to do enable editing on the top. We can see the enable editing still there. And then you go for the slideshow.
Okay. Okay.
Do you want us to share the slide, sir?
No, wait now, Dharani, let him,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't. Yeah. Is this okay? It's okay now?
No, Dr.
Yeah,
Siddharth, we can
I can
only
see the-
see your computer, this thing. We can't see the presentation open.
Oh, okay.
If
You can just stop and
you
start.
can stop it, and then we can ask probably Dharani to again restart. Ria, do we have a copy of the presentation?
Not yet, sir.
I mailed it to you. I mailed it to you.
To me, ma'am.
Yes. Can we try sharing once?
Yeah, please do. Siddharth, you can stop it and then let
Oh.
Dharani try again. Huh?
Okay, I am so sorry.
Is it visible?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. Sorry
Sure.
for the delay. So yeah. So we are dealing with a condition which has a very vast list of differential diagnosis. So in my didactic session, I'm going to be very brief and present to you a practical approach to arrive at a clinical diagnosis and then how to confirm it with basic laboratory investigations. And the individual common causes of neonatal anemia we will try to cover during our case discussions. So this will be an algorithmic approach to a baby with anemia. So when do we say that there is neonatal anemia? So it's usually based on the hemoglobin value, which is less than 13.5 gram per deciliter, or a hematocrit less than 45% in a term newborn. And based on how low the hemoglobin is, we can categorize as mild, moderate, severe. But of course, as the term varies, for example, when we say preterm babies, then we'll have to go according to the age-wise appropriate cutoffs. So then we say anything less than 2 standard deviations of the normally expected hemoglobin or hematocrit for that particular gestational age of the baby and the age of the baby would be defined as neonatal anemia. Next slide. So when we talk about neonatal anemia, there are 3 broad categories of causes for neonatal anemia. So these are the 3 H's, that is hemorrhage, hemolysis, and hyperproduction. So at the end of our history and examination, we should have some idea as to which of these categories the baby fits into. Next slide. So let's start with the first category, hemorrhage. So the hemorrhage, just click 2 times more. Yeah. Once more. Yeah, thank you. So when we talk about hemorrhage, this could occur either prenatally or around the time of delivery or postnatally. Depending upon what is the timing of the hemorrhage occurring, the place where the bleed happens is also going to vary. For example, during the antenatal period, the hemorrhage will occur from the fetus to the mom, or it could be from one fetus to another fetus in the case of a twin pregnancy, that is monochorionic twin pregnancy. Again, when there is a feto-maternal hemorrhage occurring, that is usually because of some kind of intervention which is occurring in the mother, which could be like an external cephalic version or some kind of trauma to the abdomen or an invasive procedure like amniocentesis. So these could lead to bleeding from the fetus into the mother, leading to anemia. Or in the case of a monochorionic twin pregnancy, it could be a fetus to fetus hemorrhage leading to anemia in one baby and polycythemia in the other baby. Then during the perinatal period, the bleeding will be occurring into the placenta. So this is usually because of placental abnormalities like abruptio placentae, placenta previa, or it could be something like a cord rupture. Sometimes when there is an emergency cesarean section being performed, there is an increased risk of injuries occurring, especially to the placenta, which can again lead to fetoplacental hemorrhage. And whenever there is a manual placenta removal, when the placenta is not spontaneously delivered, the manual placenta removal can also contribute to a fetoplacental hemorrhage. Then when we talk about postnatal hemorrhage, then that is happening within the baby only. That is, so it could either be an internal hemorrhage. Again, this could be a visible hemorrhage. Like for example, you have a baby with cephal hematoma or a skin bleed, then it is quite visible, or a GI bleed, then it is a witnessed or visible bleeding. But sometimes it could also be an internal hemorrhage occurring into viscera, such as the adrenals or the liver or the spleen, in which case externally there might not be any manifestation of bleeding except only pallor and anemia. So these type of bleeds are especially common when there are complicated deliveries like say breech delivery or instrumental delivery where forceps or vacuum are used, when there is a macrosomia and the baby is large, when there is sepsis which can lead to thrombocytopenia, DIC, and therefore predispose the baby to bleeding, or we have a delivery of a baby with an inherited bleeding disorder. So it is well known for babies with conditions such as hemophilia and other severe bleeding disorders to actually have bleeding in the neonatal period, which can itself manifest as anemia. And also when we need to do resuscitation in the newborns and we are doing CPR, that could also lead to visceral hemorrhage and neonatal anemia. And of course, last but not least, we should always keep in mind iatrogenic, that is babies who are admitted in the NICUs who require multiple sampling. Often that itself might lead to neonatal anemia. Next slide. So when do we clinically suspect that the anemia in a newborn is secondary to hemorrhage? So one thing is we always need to take a very detailed antenatal and perinatal history, because most of the causes that I have listed in the previous slide would be documented usually in the records in the antenatal or the perinatal records. So we will make out if any such procedures have happened or any kind of complications have happened in the delivery which might lead to a hemorrhage. So it's always important to open the records and file and read through, particularly in the case of neonates, because you might not have a vocal history like you get in older children. And also we have to look from head to toe for any signs of a visible bleeding, like a subgaleal hemorrhage. Remember, you should always measure the occipitofrontal circumference, and for every 1 centimeter increase in the head circumference, it's said that it might correspond to up to 40 ml of loss of blood. Cephal hematoma is also often obvious, and you should look for bruising on the body. Then there are two categories of hemorrhage. So if the hemorrhage was acute, which has happened, just in the time of the perinatal period or in the postnatal period, in the acute hemorrhage will usually manifest with a hypovolemic vital instability. So the babies will often have tachycardia, they might have respiratory distress, and the BP will be on the lower side. And you can measure the venous pressure will be low. So all these things will point towards the hypovolemia in the case of an acute blood loss scenario. Whereas if you're having a chronic blood loss, for example, there has been during the antenatal period, there has been a chronic feto-maternal hemorrhage or a feto-fetal hemorrhage occurring, then you will usually see a disproportionate pallor. And because the baby has been having chronic anemia, they might be actually developing congestive cardiac failure. So features like hepatomegaly might be present when the baby is born. Next slide, please. Next, we come to the topic, the second category of neonatal anemia after hemorrhage, and that is hemolysis. So there are, as you all know, there are so many causes of hemolytic anemias. To remember it easily, we always need to picture the RBC traveling through the blood vessel. So in the RBC, you know that the start from the center of the RBC, we have the hemoglobin. So we have the inherited hemoglobinopathies where the globin production is defective. And in newborns, remember, beta thalassemia and sickle cell diseases, which are diseases of the beta chains, are unlikely to manifest because when a baby is born, the majority of the hemoglobin is constituted by fetal hemoglobin. And only after 6 months of age, it is the adult hemoglobin which takes over. So usually the beta globin chain disorders like thalassemia and sickle cell will manifest in the second half of infancy and not in the newborn period. Whereas alpha thalassemia and very rarely gamma thalassemia, they might manifest in the newborn period. Then outside the hemoglobin, we have the cytoplasm of the RBCs, which will contain the enzymes. So the prototype disorder which we commonly see presenting in the neonatal age group is G6PD deficiency. Of course, there are a lot of other rarer enzyme deficiencies, including pyruvate kinase and glucose phosphatidylseumerase, etc. Then we come further outside the membrane of the RBC, and the commonest which we come across is hereditary spherocytosis and other rarer conditions like elliptocytosis, stomatocytosis, and so on. Then we come outside the RBC, that is, so till now these three disorders, the hemoglobinopathies, the enzymopathies, and membranopathies are intrinsic to the RBC. Now we come outside the RBC, the extrinsic defects. So that would include circulating antibodies against the RBCs, which could most commonly be alloimmune because of blood group incompatibility between the mom and the baby, Rh or ABO, or sometimes when minor group incompatibilities. Or rarely the mother might be having an autoimmune disease like lupus or an autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and her autoantibodies might be coming into the babies through the placenta and causing hemolysis. Then finally we come to the blood vessel wall, and there might be microthrombi or some macrovascular obstruction, and that could lead to a hemolysis which we called as MAHA, that is a microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, which could be because of a disseminated intravascular coagulation or a congenital TTP or even a Kasabach-Merit syndrome, which occurs in hemangiomas. So the intrinsic defects are usually inherited and the extrinsic defects are usually acquired in the newborns. Next slide. So keeping all these differentials in mind during workup, so how do we suspect clinically? Whenever you see a case of newborn, never forget to ask what is the mother's blood group and the baby's blood group. So once you see incompatibility between the two, that the mother is negative and the baby is Rh positive, or the mother is O blood group and the baby is A or B blood group, then automatically we should keep alloimmune hemolysis as one of the top differentials. And you also need to ask for any history of an autoimmune disease in the mother. And we also need to probe into the family history, because most of these hemolytic anemias are inherited. We need to ask about consanguinity, quite common in South India. And we also need to ask about transfusions, jaundice, gallbladder stones, and splenectomy in the family. So it's not enough to just ask the family members whether they have anemia or transfusion. We should also need to probe into cholecystectomy at a young age and so on. Then neonatal jaundice. So very often we as hematologists will be called by the neonatologist when they work up a baby for neonatal jaundice. So whenever the neonatal jaundice requires intervention like phototherapy and so on, we should always do at least a complete blood count and a peripheral smear. And if that shows evidence of hemolysis, we should take a hematology consult to see if it could be a possible hemolytic. And of course, most of these conditions are associated with hepatosplenomegaly, because usually the hemolysis is extravascular, and or in conditions like thalassemia, you might have extra medullary hematopoiesis, which could contribute to hepatosplenomegaly. And always do a head-to-toe examination and look for any hemangiomas, because if there are external hemangiomas, there might also be visceral hemangiomas inside, which could lead to the Kasabach-Merritt phenomenon. Next. Then finally, we come to the category of hypoproduction, right? That means the bone marrow is not producing enough amount of RBCs. So again, we can divide this into inherited, infiltrative, and infectious diseases. Inherited diseases, the commonest which presents as pure red cell aplasia is Diamond-Blackfan anemia. The median age group of presentation is actually 2 months. So you can have presentation in the newborn age group. Other rarer syndrome like Pearson-Marrow syndrome, where you can have neonatal anemia and also pancytopenia with exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. It's a mitochondrial disease. And of course, congenital dyserythropoietic anemia. So even though this is actually a marrow syndrome, this often manifests like a hemolytic anemia. The presentation will be with anemia, with jaundice, and hepatosplenomegaly. So clinically, one would suspect hemolysis, but then all the workup will be negative, and finally the marrow will pick up congenital dyserythropoiesis. Then infiltrative diseases, relatively rare, but we have to keep in mind, like congenital leukemias, neuroblastoma, particularly stage 4S. If the baby has a Down's phenotype, we should always think of transient abnormal myelopoiesis. And another very rare differential, but which can be picked up in an X-ray, is osteopetrosis. But it is usually unusual for these infiltrative diseases to present as isolated anemia. Invariably, there will be also thrombocytopenia with or without neutropenia in these babies. Then finally, we come to the infectious category. So strictly speaking, these are not purely hypoproliferative etiologies. Often the infections might also contribute to hemolysis also. So this includes your classical TORCH category of infections, which is your toxoplasma, your rubella, cytomegalovirus, herpes, and also your treponema pallidum, syphilis. HIV infection very rarely manifests in the neonatal age group. However, if the mother is HIV positive and she is on zidovudine therapy, that zidovudine can cross into the baby and lead to anemia in the baby. So it is important to know the HIV status. Parvovirus B19 infection usually only manifests in those people who have reduced RBC lifespan, like hemolytic anemias or immunodeficiency. But we have to remember that newborns have a reduced RBC lifespan compared to older children. So they can manifest, even if otherwise immunocompetent without any inherited disorders, they could still manifest parvoviral anemia. Then rarely you have adenovirus. Congenital malaria, rare, but something which we should always keep in mind. Peripheral smear will easily pick it up. And sometimes they might not mount fever. It could just be purely anemia with or without organomegaly. And the peripheral smear will pick up your plasmodium. And of course, sepsis in a sick baby with anemia. Again, sepsis could very well be the cause. Next slide. So hypoproduction, always ask the maternal drug intake. For the TORCH infections, we all know the classical history. We ask of antenatal fever and rash. And in any pediatric case, anthropometry gives a lot of clues to the diagnosis. Most of the Diamond-Blackfan anemic babies will be small for gestational age. You might see microcephaly in your TORCH infections, and you should look at the head-to-toe for any kind of a physical anomaly or constitutional anomaly, particularly in the craniofacial region, because Diamond-Blackfan babies have usually midline craniofacial defects. They'll have broad forehead, widely spaced eyes, that is hypertelorism, flattened nose, and they can also have cleft lip and palate. So everything occurs in the mid part of the face, and they might also have thumb abnormalities like triphalangeal thumb or a bifid thumb. So always look at all these things. And the stigmata of torch infections that we commonly discuss in our MD education, like jaundice, pallor, hepatosplenomegaly, skin rash, cataracts, blueberry muffin rash, all these are stigmata of torch infections. Hepatosplenomegaly, remember, is classically absent in diamond blackfin anemia. Usually, if there is significant hepatosplenomegaly, it almost rules out the possibility of diamond blackfin. But at the same time, other disorders like congenital erythropoietic anemia and infiltrative conditions like leukemia, they might have hepatosplenomegaly. And then features of exocrine pancreatic insufficiency like bulky stools, etc., can also point towards a Pearson-Marrow syndrome. So these are the clinical clues to hyperproliferative syndromes. Next slide. So this is just to show you some pictures. This is one of my patients who we are treating for diamond blackfin anemia. So you can appreciate how the eyes are quite far apart, the nose is flat, and the philtrum is slightly elongated. And on the right hand side, you can see a torch infection, skin rash, and also cataract. So we should always look for all these clues. Next slide. So now we come to the laboratory approach. We have a clinical, so somewhat from the history examination, we can deduce, is it a hemorrhage, is it a hyperproliferative syndrome, or is it a hemolysis? Now for all neonatal anemias, we will get at least one pre-transfusion complete blood count with a retic count and a smear. This will give us a world of clues to the diagnosis. And we will go in 4 steps, starting with step 1 retic count, followed by DCT, then the indices, followed by peripheral smear. So let's go to step 1. Next slide. So starting with the retic count. Retic count is a marker of RBC production. So if the retic count is elevated, that means the marrow is normal and it is trying to compensate for the anemic process by producing more reticulocytes. So normally in the first 2-3 days of life, the retic count might be slightly elevated up to 3 to 10%, but beyond the 3 days of life, it becomes normal. So anything more than 2% would be elevated beyond the first 2-3 days of life. So if the retic count is low or inappropriately low for the hemoglobin, then we know that something is wrong with the bone marrow. It could be a diamond blackfin anemia, or there could be a drug-induced suppression, congenital dyserythropoietic anemia, infiltrative disease of the marrow. They will all have a low retic count. But if it is an increased retic count, then it is a hemorrhage or a hemolysis. Next slide. So step 2, we will now do. Now the differentials are hemorrhage and hemolysis. So now we will do DCT, because the commonest cause that we encounter in neonatal hemolysis is the alloimmune antibodies because of blood group incompatibility. So DCT positivity means there are circulating antibodies. Either it could be because of the alloimmune disease, blood group incompatibility, or rarely maternal autoantibodies if the mother has a primary autoimmune disease like SLE or an autoimmune hemolytic anemia. If the DCT is negative, then we will now look at it is a non-immune hemolytic anemia or a hemorrhage happening. So let's go to step 3. Next slide. This is the red cell indices. So if the MCV,
क्योंकि न्यूबॉर्न में ज्यादा चांसेस ऑफ हेमोलिटिक उसके होते हैं ना, मदर ब्लड ग्रुप बेबी ब्लड ग्रुप देखो पहले रेटिक काउंट करो.
somebody is speaking, but I
Yeah,
can't.
yeah, we'll mute everyone. Riya, can you do that, please?
Yeah. So red cell indices.
I have muted everyone.
Yeah. If the MCV and MCH are low, that is microcytic hypochromic indices.
Dr. Siddharth, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, so I was saying once the DCT is negative and the retic count is elevated, that's the scenario we're talking about. So we're either talking about a non-immune hemolysis or a chronic hemorrhage. So in chronic hemorrhage, usually we'll have low MCV, low MCH. Another differential for microcytic hypochromic is thalassemia. And also one clue from the MCHC, if it is very much high, then it could be hereditary spherocytosis. Next slide. Then finally, we look at the peripheral smear. So a peripheral smear seen by a trained hematologist can give us a diagnosis in so many cases. So if it is a normal peripheral smear and the retic count is elevated, we can look into the history and see if there is any scenario for an acute blood loss. Then membranopathies, usually we can pick up spherocytes or elliptocytes or stomatocytes depending upon the condition. We should look for schistocytes Especially if clinically we are suspecting a microangiopathic hemolysis, it's always good to call your hematologist and ask them to specifically look at the smear for schistocytes, which can be seen in DAC or other causes of MAHA. Target cells, already Dharani told, normally it can be present in newborns to a small extent, but if there is a lot of target cells, we can think of thalassemia. And it is always good to do a supravital staining of the smear, especially when you have a high retic count hemolysis happening, and there you can pick up white cells in the G6PD deficiency and also Golf body inclusions typical in alpha thalassemia or the HPH disease. Next slide. So these are just to show you pictures of G6PD deficiency, the white cells, and malaria, which is picked up in peripheral smear by seeing the parasites in the RBC. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so finally, once we know, sorry, the previous one, please. Yeah, so finally to confirm, now from the history examination and the 4 steps of baseline investigations, we will know what we are dealing with. So if from all this workup, we are suspecting a hemorrhage, and if it is a feto-maternal hemorrhage, we can do the Klein-Hoyer-Betke test. It will be talked about in detail in the case discussion to see if it is a fetal blood coming to the maternal blood. Nowadays, we have even superior technique like flow cytometry to prove feto-maternal hemorrhage. If it is hemolysis, depending upon what we are suspecting, like HS, we would be doing a osmotic fragility or a eosin maleimide binding assay. If it is a thalassemia, then we would be doing a hemoglobin variant analysis. Enzymopathies, we can test for the enzyme levels. And finally, and this is not a rare situation for a a super specialty hospital hematologist. Often, when the patients they will come, they will already have all these things done, like HB variant and G6PD levels, and all things would have been done. And if it is all normal and still there is evidence of hemolysis on the smear and reticon, it is always good to get an NGS panel done. It is now available both in some institutes as well as private labs like MedGenome are doing it, and then you will get the genetic diagnosis as to what inherited disorder you are dealing with. And finally, if it is a hyperproliferative syndrome, you're suspecting a DBA or a CDA, then you will have to do a bone marrow test to prove the diagnosis. Next slide. So that's just to show you a picture of one of our patients with the CDA type 1. You can see the binucleated erythroblast, and also in this circled erythroblast, you can see one small line connecting the 2 nuclei. That is actually the internuclear bridging, which is typical of type 1 CDA. Next one. And this is just to show you a picture of a HBH disease, which we saw when I was in PGI. So this, you can see that the supravital staining will show a lot of these Golf body inclusions, multiple spots on the cells. And the HB variant, it will show this twin integration peaks. Usually you have only one small peak in the starting of the HBL. So you'll have this twin peaks. It is highly suggestive of alpha thalassemia. And of course, then you can do a gene sequencing of the alpha chain gene, and that will show you the mutation. Next, please. Then just to touch upon anemia of prematurity, we'll be talking about this in detail with the cases. It's just an exaggeration of the normal physiological anemia which we see in newborns. And this is usually seen in less than 32 weeks of gestation babies, and it will be in inappropriately low retic count and inappropriately low erythropoietin concentration, presenting with a hemoglobin of 8 to 10 or a hematocrit of less than equal to 28% at 5 to 10 weeks. And the more preterm the baby is, the lesser the hemoglobin will be, and the earlier the prematurity anemia can manifest. Next slide. So to summarize, based on the history and examination, we can come to a conclusion: is it a hemorrhage, a hemolysis, or a hyperproduction anemia? Always please go through the antenatal parental records, personally read them, and arrive at the syndromic diagnosis. Get a pre-transfusion complete blood count, peripheral smear, retic count, and whenever the scenario is there, get a direct Coombs test also done. And then based on all these preliminary investigations, you can plan your confirmatory investigation. Keep in mind that your sampling itself can be a cause or a exacerbator of your neonatal anemia. Thank you.
Dharani, are you around? I don't know whether Dharani's got disconnected again. No, she's there.
We are there, sir.
Yeah.
It was muted. So thanks, Dr. Siddharth, for the detailed discussion. on neonatal anemia approach and the stepwise approach to the lab investigations. Sunil sir, do we have time for any questions, or we'll proceed with the case-based discussion?
No, we have time, but I think it may be better to discuss the cases and then,
Take the
because some of
questions
it
at
may
the
be covered in cases, right? So, and I
Sure,
mean,
sir.
anyways, if there are any questions anyone has, they probably can ask now also.
Yeah, I think we can start the case discussion. Most of the cases will actually cover the doubts that might be asked, and then we can take up the one.
I have a small question. May I ask a small question, please?
Yes, please, Vinita, please go ahead.
Often we come across patients coming with hereditary spherocytosis. So, which test would you recommend in our setting, and where should we send that test for confirmation? Like, we will do the peripheral smear here itself, and clinically also we suspect hereditary spherocytosis. So, next step, where should we send the test, and what test should we order?
Yeah, so Dr. Vinita, that's a very relevant question. So usually from the basis of the peripheral smear and osmotic fragility, you can arrive at the diagnosis of hereditary spherocytosis. But if you see go by the latest recommendations, you should ideally do a eosin myeloid binding assay, which is the recommended confirmatory test for hereditary spherocytosis. So ideally, if your center doesn't have it, you can send it across to a center which does this assay. So right now in CMC, in a short while, we'll be getting this assay, but we are going by doing the osmotic fragility test and cryohemolysis. So if both of these are positive, it quite validates the diagnosis of hereditary spherocytosis. If it is a severe, most of the Indian HS, they are very mild. They usually don't require much of transfusions, and they do quite well on folic acid supplementation. But if it is a severe disease, the transfusion requiring type, then the family might need an antenatal diagnosis for the next child. In that case, then you should try to get a genetic confirmation so that you can offer an antenatal diagnosis for the next pregnancy.
Thank you.
Vinita, do you want an honest answer as to what actually happens these days? So before, when we were practicing hematology, it was all very difficult because in the newborn period, the baby would be transfused. Then we can't, when we say come 4 weeks of transfusion, we'll have to investigate. It would have been difficult because some of the severe forms of hemolysis, they'll require transfusions every 4 weeks. So it was very difficult to diagnose. So just like young people have Google app these days, and by the time the patient walks into the room, you can see what is their diagnosis and what you should offer. So like that, we have NGS for everything. So the honest truth is that probably with time, all of the other investigations will be replaced by NGS. So you have your clinical suspicion, and instead of doing multiple tests, we probably would go straight for NGS, because by the end of this discussion, you will realize how difficult it is sometimes to say, hey, this is the cause of the anemia. So maybe the answers would be from NGS is what I feel, but it's good to look smart in front of the patients. Otherwise they do everything and then they come and tell us.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So let's start with the case-based discussion. We're running short of time. So we go to the first case discussion. Dr. Balaji will present.
Good evening, everyone. Totally, we have a 6 case discussion. Case number 1. This is a term baby, birth weight of 2.85 kg, delivered by emergency LSCS because of meconium stain Baker. Perinatal transition was uneventful. Maternal details: she is a 28-year-old female, booked and immunized, primi gravida. She had anemia at 18 weeks and was corrected with oral line therapy. Baby was on direct breast feeds, however found to be prick at 22 hours of life. On examination, baby was active, playful, it was normal, except for weight loss of 4%. Systemic examination was normal. There was stress up to the lower abdomen level.
So Dr. Siddharth, can you just quickly go through what are the differentials that you would consider at this point of time?
Yeah. So we can see that there is neonatal jaundice, and the neonatal jaundice has started within 24 hours. So always neonatal jaundice starting within 24 hours is pathological and requires further workup. So, and most likely when there is a neonatal jaundice and anemia, the likely cause is going to be hemolysis. So the first thing I would want is to do a complete blood count, peripheral smear, and if there is a blood group incompatibility from the history, include a direct Coombs test. And also we need to know the bilirubin level so that we can plan the intervention. Is it going to be an exchange transfusion or a phototherapy?
Thanks. So,
Yes, the investigations are projected. CBC then showed hemoglobin of 13 with PC of 38.5. MC was 110. Total count and platelets are normal. Reticulocyte count is 10.2% with VCT positive. Peripheral smear showed normostatic normochromic RBCs with low RBC count and occasional spherocytes. Serum bilirubin then showed indirect hyperbilirubinemia with indirect bilirubin of 18.5%. Rest of the urea creatinine newborn screening were normal. Blood group of the mother and baby are O positive and P positive respectively.
so that confirms the pathological jaundice that Dr. Siddharth described with ABO incompatibility and mild anemia with the neonatal jaundice. So this smear shows the spherocytes that are characteristically seen in the smear of ABO incompatible hemolysis. So we would like to discuss on the clinical differences and the practical points that we should know when it comes to ABO versus RH incompatibility, and how do we go about it. Dr. Uma Maheshwari, can you take it up?
First of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity and for including me as guest here in the hematology conference. First of all, we would usually think that RH incompatibility is a disease of fetus, whereas ABO incompatibility is a condition which happens in the newborn. So we know that ABO would happen even in the first pregnancy as such in primary. That is because of the prevailing antibodies. If you see any neonate who is born, they will not have automatically anti-RH antibodies or anti-D antibodies. So it is induced. Compared to ABO blood group, especially the people who are O blood group, they have natural antibodies. That is because of exposure to natural substance and bacteria in their early life, and they start producing antibodies somewhere between like 4 to 6 months of age. And the predominant antibodies in RH is IgG, whereas in ABO it is IgM. But some of the O positive mothers can produce IgG. That is why we are seeing ABO incompatibility in neonatal period. As I already mentioned, like the pregnancy affected is mostly second gravida in RH. That is because of previous baby being RH positive, or they could have done some procedure during pregnancy in terms of amniocentesis or like abortion. That could have exposed to some fetal-maternal hemorrhage, which induces the antibodies. RH is usually a severe disease. As I said, it appears in the neonate, in the fetal period itself, whereas ABO is less severe. It's very, very rare case reports are there where they have described ABO incompatibility presenting as high drops. So usually if it is presenting with high drops, we need to look for RH or other minor blood group incompatibilities. Anti-L, which can present as high drops as well and require intrauterine transfusion. Coming to antigen expression, we should be wondering like why RH is so severe. It is because of the difference in the antigen expression. The antigen expression of RH happens only in RBCs, whereas ABO, as we know, happens both in the RBCs as well as in other tissues. So even if the antibody is crossing from the placenta and reaches the fetus, it kind of binds with other tissues. Monitoring during pregnancy will not be needed in ABO, whereas in RH, we kind of do ICT titers in the mother, and if the titers are increasing, then nowadays there are tests available which we could do from the mothers, which we call it as NIPT, non-invasive prenatal testing, to find out the fetal genotype, especially if the father is heterozygous, and follow it up with fetal MCA Doppler changes, which is more invasive compared to the previously adopted way of doing optical density in the amniotic fluid So compared to that, with the Doppler changes, which will be monitored from around 16 to 18 weeks onwards when the ICT titers are high, so we will be able to pick up and identify which fetus would need intrauterine transfusion. So treatment, as I mentioned, it is intrauterine transfusion. So it is feasible to do somewhere from 20 to 22 weeks onwards, so that we can kind of increase the surviving chance of the fetus inside, and we can deliver the baby once the baby's lungs are more mature, maybe like 32, 34 weeks is what we are looking at. Whereas in ABO incompatibility, the treatment is mostly phototherapy. Very, very rarely they would need exchange transfusion. There are preventive measures which are available for RH in terms of availability of anti-D immunoglobulin administration for the mother, which the obstetrician should take care to administer within 72 hours, and they should know to quantify if at all they have done some procedures, and if they anticipate there is an increased risk of fetal-maternal hemorrhage. So accordingly, the quantity of anti-D to be administered also varies, whereas in ABO there is none as a preventive measure. Like we have already said that the management would include phototherapy, exchange transfusion. Of course, because there will be a lot of erythropoiesis which is happening, you need folic acid for that, which we start somewhere from a week onwards. And we have to avoid medications which causes bilirubin which alters the bilirubin metabolism.
Thank you. So this is a million-dollar question, Rajesh. So when it comes to severe hemolytic disease of the newborn, the question of IVIG always comes up. So I would like answers from both of you. So in RH and in ABO incompatibility, I would like to hear from Revati ma'am first.
Okay, so thanks Dharani again for the interesting session on neonatal anemias, and I think the IVIG has been very beautifully looked at, and there are enough guidelines now, and the AAP guidelines clearly says in this setup that if you use IVIG at a dose of 500 milligram per kg over 2 hours, as soon as you see that the hemoglobin is low at birth, there's hyperbilirubinemia within 48 hours, you may be able to prevent an exchange transfusion. So the other thing is that the use of IVIG early also helps prevent late anemias, because this hemolysis, remember, keeps going on and on 6 to 8 weeks later. So sometimes they're discharged from the neonatal unit, and because of ongoing hemolysis, they need to come back for a top-up transfusion. So I think it's good practice to consider IVIG early. Once there is fully established rigorous hemolysis, I don't think IVIG is going to prevent an exchange transfusion. But if it's started early, there is enough evidence, and the newborn regimen for giving IVIG is different to how we use, and they actually use 500 per kg, quite infuse it faster than we do at over 2 hours. So that is the recommendation. Whereas in hematology, we are used to 6 to 8 hour transfusion. Uma can add to what, yeah.
I'm going to be in your opposite side as long as IVIG is concerned. Though I agree with you that the Cochrane, which is published in 2018, did say that considering all the studies, they said that it reduces the risk of exchange transfusion. If you see here, 0.26 was the RR, whereas when they did a sensitivity analysis and when they put only studies which had of high quality evidence together, they found that it did not reduce the chance of exchange transfusion. In the sense, it did not reduce the rate of exchange transfusion to be done for these babies, putting together RH and ABO. Next slide, please. So this is again same grading. When they said the very low quality studies, when they included, the RR was good, but when they included the moderate quality studies, the RR was low, and the extent transfusion performed per infant also did not vary with the moderate quality studies. So next slide. We know that IVV IgG is not without complications, so they can have adverse reactions. They can have immune-mediated hemolysis and circulatory overload, etc. So if we compare the benefit versus risk, the recent NNF guideline as well as like what we practice in our unit is we do not give IV IgG to reduce the risk of, to reduce the need for extend transfusion in incompatible babies because the evidence says so. Next slide. So I would be in crossroads with Revati ma'am saying that there is no role for IVIGG in the present, with the present evidence either as a treatment or as prophylaxis.
I think this is the whole field of neonatology. No, there's a lot of evidence that comes for and against everything. It's the same for IVIG. It's the same for recombinant erythropoietin. There'll be one set of studies which categorically says, yes, this is good. And then another set of studies says, oh no, don't use it because the adverse effects are far more than the benefits. So from what I can see over time is because we've been observing all these hemolytic anemias babies over time, even if they are going to have brisk hemolysis, whatever we do, we are going to end up doing that exchange transfusion. But I think it does probably have a role in the babies that don't have brisk hemolysis, and we use what happens most of the time is we are discussing with families, should we use the IVIG or not? And the time when you're supposed to give the infusion is crossed. And then invariably we've crossed the threshold. So we end up doing the exchange. But in the ones that have a slow onset hemolysis, it may help in at least preventing them from coming back for a top-up transfusion. So I wouldn't really discount the complete, to say that it doesn't have a role at all. It would have a role, but as you rightly said, to dish it out to everyone may not be useful, especially if you've thrown in a very expensive drug only 6 hours later to go and remove it with an exchange transfusion. That seems like a shame to do. So selectively, if your gut feeling says, whatever I do, he's going to end up having an exchange transfusion, don't use the IVIG. If you feel that this may be a child that we can prevent the use, especially when they are very tiny babies and you know that their stay in the NICU is going to be prolonged, you're going to do multiple tests, invariably they're going to end up having a transfusion. The whole point of using IVIG is whether we can avoid giving a blood product. So a red cell transfusion. So if that's not going to be the case, I would still say there is a role, but we have to choose which baby we're going to use for carefully, and probably at least use it for the ones which we can prevent delayed hemolysis and the ones that come back for a top-up transfusion. I'm happy to have a debate on this. Yeah. It's the thing that we can look at papers differently, and it is an expensive drug. And when we have a practice where we are dealing with low and middle income families, we have to be careful in saying whether this drug is useful or not. Definitely.
Yes, ma'am. Can't agree more, ma'am. Actually, like we also have been using at one particular point of time, but as evidence changed, like we are no longer using in our unit. So that's our practice. But I think individual units should have their own guidelines to guide on this, because the evidences are changing and the evidences are coming up as such.
Agree. So I think it's the anticipation of the rapidity of the hemolysis and the timing is most important. That's what I can make out. Anyway, we can discuss it over. So Dr. Siddharth, if you can quickly discuss this. In a baby with expected hemolytic disease and requiring transfusions, how do we monitor and manage? As Dr. Revati ma'am pointed out that it's a long drawn process. So how do we go about it?
Yeah, next slide. So we are particularly talking about the context of babies who have received intrauterine transfusion or have undergone exchange transfusions. So in these babies, there is a peculiar phenomenon where there is a delayed hyporegenerative anemia. On one hand, like what Revati ma'am said, the hemolysis itself might linger on for a while, and they might require top-up transfusions for up to 8 weeks. On the other hand, what happens is when we transfuse these babies with Rh negative RBCs, as the lifespan gets over, they're going to lose these transfused RBCs. And because of the transient erythroblastopenia, there is also going to be an inadequate replacement of these cells which are getting lost. And whatever RBCs the baby produces will be destroyed by the circulating IgG antibodies. So we have to monitor these patients closely by doing 1 to 2 weekly counts till they reach 12 weeks of age and transfuse as per the center's guidelines. And there are some recommendations for giving supplements like folic acid, B12, iron, and even vitamin E. But then there is no conclusive evidence for the same.
Thank you. So our baby was managed with double surface phototherapy, and the values have been dropping, and there was no further drop in hemoglobin. And the phototherapy could be stopped in 4 days and discharged the baby on 7th day of life, and the baby was rightly started on folic acid, and follow-up was uneven. So we move on to the second case.
I just add on this 1 second, Dharni, to say that over time, all the studies that we are comparing, the delivery of phototherapy also has made huge advances. You know, so I think that is also changing guidelines. So what you see in the 1990s and to early 2000 will be different today, because your phototherapy units are far more sophisticated for reduce, because mostly we would do an exchange for hyperbilirubinemia initially, and only after that the HB drops. So I think all of these are changing guidelines, absolutely. And so we have to keep looking at risk versus benefit before we recommend any medications, especially to these small babies.
Agree, ma'am, definitely. So I've just put these questions for the fellows to just keep them away. So they can answer in the chat box. We will discuss the answers at the end. So you can see this question for the next 5 seconds. Which blood group antigen doesn't initiate an immune hemolytic anemia in newborns? And second question is, which minor blood group incompatibility can suppress the fetal erythropoiesis? So you can answer in the chat box. We'll come to it at the end. So we'll go to the case.
This is a 25 plus 3 weeker girl child, born by normal vaginal delivery in outside hospital and referred to NICU for further management. The baby had a respiratory distress syndrome and also had suspicion of sepsis. She is a 28-year-old, mother is a 28-year-old and semigravida. She had cervical encerclage for cervical incompetence. There was no history of PROM or bleeding TB. Maternal WBC count was elevated and CRP was possible. She presented with labor pain with bulging membranes. Apgar was 3 by 10 and 7 by 10. Birth weight was 700 grams. 2 doses of surfactant was given and continued on CPAP. For suspected sepsis, septic workup was done. However, it was negative and IV antibiotics stopped on day 4. USG cranium showed grade 1 IVH, which was not worsening. Feeds were initiated on day 3 and escalated. However, on day 9 of life, the baby noticed to have apneic episodes. They evaluated. Here we see that the hemoglobin has dropped from 19.5 to 7 grams, and MCV has dropped from 99 to 83, with no much change in total count and RBC. Perissos may show microcytic hypochromic anemia with leukocytosis. Procalcitonin is negative and blood culture was sterile.
Revati ma'am, may I ask you, so we know that this child who's an extreme premature child has anemia. So how do you proceed with this and investigate?
So this is something I think most preterm units, Uma, can agree with this, that you know for sure that this baby is going to require a transfusion because they've come in early, and we are going to be doing blood tests on them every single day, and hemoglobin is low. So we have, Siddharth beautifully said, Why is someone anemic? Are they not making enough, or are they losing blood somewhere, or is their blood being broken down? So the 3 H's, is it hypoproduction or hemorrhage or hemolysis? And for different age groups, you would see that the most important reason for anemia will be different. For example, in the newborn period, the majority of the causes of anemia is hemolysis. But if you see later when the children grow up, it's mostly iron deficiency. So there's lack of production. And if you see anemia in adults, you have to rule out a bleed. So so for every age group, the most common cause is different. So if a small baby like this is anemic, so first we'll have to be to record how much blood loss is there per day. Initially, did they have any fetal-maternal bleed? So I would think mostly in terms of blood loss in this baby, and baby could have been sick or septic. Because of that, the blood production could have gone down because of anemia of acute infection. So the babies respond to stress in a different manner compared to older children, so newborn babies. So they are a little bit like the elderly, the extremes of age. So once they are stressed, they sometimes stop production altogether. So, and all of the things that we do with the peripheral smears are again difficult, because you will see nucleated red cells in normal preterm babies. You will see spherocytes in normal newborn babies. So retics can be high, LDH can be high, because their erythropoiesis is different in the newborn babies to others. So as Siddharth said, we have to evaluate step by step. So in this baby, I would think more in terms of blood loss. First, look at the retic count, and if the baby is symptomatic, according to the NNF guidelines, proceed with transfusion, because sometimes when we are just investigating, we may lose the plot and make the baby more anemic. So definitely the top of the list would be blood loss in this case.
Thank you, ma'am. So as I rightly said, the baby had a grade 1 IVH to start with, and septic screen, and so many investigations were done. And also the baby was an extreme preterm baby. The septic screen, when we evaluated at apnea, was again negative. There was no obvious GI loss or progression of hemorrhage, and there was no further loss of blood. So we put it as an possible anemia of prematurity. So the index child was managed with transfusions as it was required. The apneic episode had settled with transfusion, and the septic screen was negative as mentioned. The baby was started on oral iron supplementation with when the baby, after ensuring the good gut tolerance. So Dr. Uma, can you take up with these questions, the anemia of prematurity? Can you enlighten us about it?
I agree with ma'am that iatrogenic blood loss is something which we really need to think and prevent as a preventive aspect for anemia of prematurity. So if you are asking me incidence, I would say that our ELBW babies, it will be almost 100%, they will have anemia at some point, and almost 70 to 80% of a 25-weeker would receive transfusion at some stage. So why would we become anemic? There are some physiological contributors and there are some non-physiological contributors. If you come to physiological contributors, that the erythropoiesis is happening in the liver, and liver to kidney switch, there is issue in our preterm babies because it happens only around 32 weeks. The babies are growing rapidly and there is a shortened RBC lifespan, and also the left shift because of high HbF, which prevents the oxygen to deliver into the tissues, and low level of EPO, which I will subsequently enlighten why the erythropoietin levels are low, and also the cardiovascular factors. These are physiological contributors, whereas non-physiological contributors would be the lab blood loss, inadequate nutrition, and also non-lab blood loss like though IVH grade 1 will not contribute so much, maybe a higher grade of IVH or necrotizing enterocolitis would contribute. Sepsis, it's a great mimicker. Sepsis in this particular baby, when day 9 apnea, we would have definitely thought of sepsis, and the bone marrow suppression will automatically happen because of some sepsis contributing to it. All these things, next slide, all these things is because of the developmental immaturity of the preterm baby. And a little bit word about erythropoietin. These are the physiological points which I want to highlight here. As we know, the higher tissue oxygenation set point for erythropoietin production happens in the kidneys. Whereas liver, as far as in the fetal, the fetus is hypoxic, and the erythropoietin set point is at a lower, it is at a lower level when it is happening in the liver. And when the babies are coming to us at 25, 26 or 27 weeker, the erythropoietin which is produced in the liver acts as a paracrine effect. So that is why the erythropoietin is not kind of entering into the serum. That is why we are getting a low serum EPO, though the paracrine effect of erythropoietin continues. And we know that there is an increased sensitivity of erythroid progenitor. Even though the erythropoietin levels are low, the progenitor cells are very sensitive to erythropoietin. And newborns, at least, they kind of clear the erythropoietin 2 to 4 times more than compared to a infant or an older age group, and they have higher erythropoietic capacity. Even though there is a low erythropoietin, at all points, they kind of the low erythropoietin level has a paracrine effect at any particular point of time. This I found very interesting, that this is a lab data, which lab phlebotomy data, which says that the average average blood loss due to phlebotomy in first week will be around 11, somewhere around 11 to 36 ml. So it can kind of range as low as 11 ml to as high as 36 ml per kg, which is a huge loss. Next slide. And also it kind of correlates positively with the transfusion. So what we can do as a neonatology, next slide, as neonatologists is to cut down the number of blood tests which we do, restrict the labs, and also move to point of care values, like blood gases. We can see the electrolytes in blood gas instead of asking electrolytes from the lab. Next slide. So the most important physiological preventive aspect is delayed cord clamping, which one can do in the labor room, in the delivery suit itself. The baby is able to move and breathe on the bone. We kind of delay the cord clamping for at least 60 seconds in premature babies, taking care of the temperature, and also provide adequate nutrition in terms of early aggressive parenteral nutrition and enteral nutrition, compared to babies who are on 1 to 1.5 grams to 3 to 3.5 grams of protein. The babies who are put on 3 to 3.5 grams of protein per day require less transfusion. We have to replenish iron storage. Somewhere when the babies are double the birth weight, say for example, this particular baby is 700 grams, once they reach like 1400 grams, that is when their iron storage will start coming down. So before that, we usually in our unit, we start around 4 weeks, somewhere between 2 to 4 milligram per kg of iron supplement. They do tolerate very well. There is no increased risk of infection. Adequate vitamins like B12 and folate. Coming to erythropoietin, again, as Revati ma'am correctly said, erythropoietin, we all had a very positive gear and we geared up to start, and then now evidence is telling that, okay, please wait on the next slide. Next, wait on the erythropoietin. Next slide. So this is a Cochrane review which is published very recently in 2020, which included 34 studies with 3,643 infants, and they found they kind of looked at the use of red cell transfusions, volume of RBC transfused, and the donor exposure after the study entry, giving erythropoietin within 1 week of life. Previously, there were some concerns that erythropoietin increases the incidence of retinopathy of prematurity. Now that concern has gone. But however, the Cochrane has concluded that And the smaller reduction is it is of limited clinical importance. So right now in our unit we are not using erythropoietin, even though as a neuroprotective we had question mark. And regarding transfusion, that is the only treatment aspect available. So it depends basically on the cardiorespiratory state. If the baby is apneic, if the baby is septic, if the baby is on ventilator requiring high oxygen, we kind of have a very liberal cutoff for transfusing. Restrictive versus liberal, I'll come to it in a minute. We usually do a small volume transfusion somewhere between 10 to 15 ml, because whatever erythropoietin is there, we do not want to suppress the existing erythropoietin by giving adult blood. And it is preferable to give single donor transfusion. You can make up multiple bags from a single donor and label for one baby and keep on giving that blood for a single neonate. So coming to the evidence for restrictive versus liberal transfusion, a systematic review which came up in 2014, including 3 studies, they said there is no difference in the mortality or major neonatal morbidities. Next slide. So this is the very next slide. This is the kind of expected study. All of us were looking forward for the results of this ETT-NO study, which is threshold for effects of transfusion threshold on neurodevelopmental outcome. So this is the largest study, which included 1,000 and odd babies with a mean gestation of 26 weeks. Next slide. So they kind of found no difference in the death or major neurodisability for liberal versus restrictive. Next slide. As well as there is no difference in IVH, necrotizing enterocolitis, PDA, sepsis, ROP or PVL between liberal group and restrictive threshold group. Next. So these are various upper and lower limits of thresholds used in different studies, namely Bell et al., Pine study, ETT-NO study, and top study, the results will be out in 2023. So if they compared everything, it is the evidence is favorable for restrictive transfusion. So here you can see these are the upper and lower limit for liberal and restrictive transfusion used in various studies. So restrictive transfusion, the lower cutoff were 7 if they were hemodynamically stable, and 11 if they needed some cardiorespiratory support. Whereas in liberal transfusion, lower cutoff was around 9 to 10, and upper cutoff were somewhere between 13 to 15. Next slide. So this is the recent NNF guidelines, evidence-based guidelines derived on 2019. So it depends, transfusion, basically the cutoff for transfusion depends on what day of life and what week of life and what cardiorespiratory support the neonate needs. Because the transfusion mainly depends on the tissue hypoxia. What we are worried about is by transfusing, we are trying to prevent tissue hypoxia. So the cardiorespiratory state plays an important role in deciding the cutoff for transfusion. So Dr. Tarani?
Dharani, maybe mute, so please unmute yourself.
You can answer the quiz question. So what is
I'm
the
sorry.
simple delivery room measure? You can answer in the chat box. What is the simple delivery room measure which you would do to prevent anemia of prematurity? The candidates can answer in
Thanks.
the... Yeah.
Thanks, ma'am, for this question. I was actually saying, sorry, I was muted. I was saying the anemia of prematurity is more in the realm of the neonatologists, but when hematologists are called for a consultation, I think our role is mainly to look at the other causes and to rule out the other causes, as the anemia of prematurity is a diagnosis of exclusion. So we shouldn't be missing the other reasons. And of course, before suggesting a transfusion, we discuss based on the clinical condition, as you rightly mentioned. So we go to the case B.
This case is from CMC. Thank you, Siddharth sir. This is a 35 plus 5 week late preterm child 2.1 kg birth weight, born by LSCS because of prior LSCS present in preterm labor. By 3 years of life, the baby was noticed to be ectric and referred to a tertiary care center. The baby has received 7 days of phototherapy and transfusion on day 3 and day 15 of life for severe anemia. The indirect hyperbilirubinemia was persisting.
Dharani, we have lost your audio. Can you hear us?
Siddharth, do you know this case? Can you take over?
Yeah, ma'am. So basically, I might not remember the investigation clearly, but the history slide is shown here. So he was again readmitted on day 45 again for anemia, and he was transfused. And on history, it was a consanguineous marriage in the parents, and the child had 2 elder siblings who are alive and well. And on the examination, we found the baby had pallor and icterus. There was not significant hepatosplenomegaly present in the baby. So in the investigations, the complete blood count had shown to us significant anemia. It was predominantly normocytic normochromic, but the retic count was very high in the range of almost 15 to 20%. So the striking feature was a very high retic count and an anemia. And the peripheral smear showed frank hemolysis. So there were increased reticulocytes. There was that led to polychromasia. But otherwise, there were no specific like target cells or spherocytes which could give us a particular diagnosis. So we knew some hemolysis was happening, but the smear was otherwise not contributing. So before I go in, I think the question was supposed to be how to approach this case. So before I go into the further investigations, if we see the clues from the clinical aspect of the case, we can see the early onset of the jaundice. So by 3 hours of life, the baby has become icteric. And the child has also required transfusion. So this combination of severe anemia and a pathological jaundice points automatically towards the hemolysis which is occurring. The next clue that we get from the history is the the consanguineous marriage. So rather than an alloimmune or an acquired disease, it is likely to be an inherited hemolytic syndrome. So that much we can make out from the history. Now in the investigation, again, it's corroborating there is hemolytic anemia. So we went on to test for the common inherited hemolytic disorder. So we had done a G6PD level that came normal. We went on to do an osmotic fragility and a cryohemolysis that was not suggestive of an hereditary spherocytosis. And hemoglobin variant analysis was a little difficult to do because his baby had already been multiple transfused, and you know that HbF levels will physiologically be elevated. So it's not very contributory to do a HB variant analysis at this point of time. Then finally, because the family was affording, then we went on to a mutation analysis. But like Revati ma'am rightly pointed out, rather than going through all these things of doing this OFT, everything, and NGS investigation is a very good investigation if you actually know for sure that you're dealing with an inherited hemolytic syndrome. So once we did the NGS, then we found out that it's a rare type of inherited hemolytic syndrome because of glucose phosphate isomerase deficiency. So that was the diagnosis that we gave.
Okay, wow. I think he's got a very rare little baby. So, I mean, obviously there's hemolysis. So one thing when we can counsel the family to say that there is hemolysis and whether this is going to be just a transient one in the newborn period or later, we have to have follow-up. And G6PD in the newborn, it's a little bit tricky because when they are actively hemolyzing and the retic is high, we can have normal levels. So conversely, we see with G6PD screening also, a lot of them come as deficient because in the cord blood when they do screening and then they come back for counseling and 6 months later when we test, it's normal. So these are difficulties that you see with G6PD assay. In cord blood, it can come low, which makes a lot of young families panic. And then when they're actively hemolyzing, retics have high G6PD levels, so it will come as normal, but they can actually be G6PD deficient. But what is happening in this baby is that the hemolysis persisted. So you should think of what could it be. And as I said earlier, in the newborn period, they will have elevated LDH, they will have slightly high retic, they will have spirocytes, NRBC. So initially it is difficult. And once they are a little bit bigger, for the osmotic fragility test, practically we need quite a significant volume of blood. They can't do it on small aliquots. And our lab insists that they should have at least 6 weeks of transfusion. And the actively hemolyzing babies, they don't give you that time of 4 to 6 weeks sometimes to actually do the test. So if you see a high bilirubin, persistently high indirect hyperbilirubinemia with a drop in hemoglobin, we have to go through, is this membrane disorder, enzyme disorder, hemoglobinopathy? One practical value, as Siddharth said, to go through the history, do the HB electrophoresis of both parents, because that will automatically at least rule out a hemoglobinopathy. Or if the mother or father have hereditary spherocytosis, which is silent, even that we can pick up. So looking at the parents' HB electrophoresis and their peripheral smear helps. And otherwise, we have to wait until they stop hemolyzing and work on the red cells, or go for NGS to give a final answer.
Thank you. I'm again sorry again that we got disconnected. So I think the major questions have already been answered. So the hemolytic anemia manifesting at birth, Dr. Siddharth had already discussed. And the pitfalls in the investigations, as ma'am rightly pointed out, the difficulties in the assays and sampling, everything is accounted. And we also have to note that the cells are osmotically resistant, and osmotic fragility testing, we have to compare with a normative curve with the neonatal standards. And the variability in the smear has to be interpreted properly. And the enzyme deficiencies, the G6PD assays, we have to interpret properly. So coming to the quiz questions for the fellows, you can point out the finding in the picture, and also name some conditions associated in this. So with this, we move to the next case.
Case 4, this is a term baby born by emergency LSCS in view of absent fetal movements. Mother is priming. Blood group of the mother is A positive. The baby cried at birth but was pale. Clinically, there was no edema, no jaundice or no organomegaly. Cord blood ABG showed a hemoglobin of 5 grams. In view of severe anemia, partial exchange transfusion was done. Baby was stabilized, and peripheral smear done showed normocytic normochromic anemia with reticulocyte count of 22.5%.
So, Dr. Siddharth, can you point out the possible diagnosis in this scenario?
In this baby, we can see clinically that the baby has evidence of some hypovolemia, volume loss. We can see that the bedside echo showing a poor contractility, and we can also see cardiomegaly in the X-ray. So it's very likely that this baby has had a hemorrhage. And since the peripheral smear is normocytic normochromic, if it was microcytic hypochromic, it would have been a chronic hemorrhage. But because of the clinical volume loss and the normocytic normochromic anemia and high retic count, it is likely to be a acute hemorrhage that has happened in this baby.
Thanks. So with the possibility of fetal-maternal hemorrhage, again, we proceeded with a Clay-Howard-Bedke test, which showed around 2.5 to 3% of fetal RBCs in the smear. So as shown here, the HbF is resistant to alkali denaturation, so they appear bright and pink, and the adult cells are lysed and they appear like ghosts. So the optimal timing for seeing the fetal cells is within 2 hours and should not be, it's not useful beyond 24 hours following delivery. So I'd like to discuss this sources of fetal-maternal hemorrhage and how do we suspect and proceed with the case of fetal-maternal hemorrhage. Revati ma'am, can you take up first?
I think Uma will be a better place to answer fetal-maternal hemorrhage. If she's missed something, I will chip in. Yeah.
Sure, ma'am. Uma ma'am.
Sorry, he unmuted. Basically, fetal-maternal hemorrhage is a diagnosis of exclusion. Once we think that there is blood loss, there is some evidence of blood loss. This baby particularly presented with, mother presented with reduced fetal movement, which is a very typical presentation of acute blood loss. If we do not have any particular evidence as such, say there is no abruption placenta or there is no vasa previa documented, etc. Our first diagnosis which we would like to rule out is fetal-maternal hemorrhage. So when this fetal and maternal barrier breaks and then they bleed across each other is a very tricky thing, and even in literature they have not really found out how this blood trafficking happens as such. So the initial thing would be to obtain history from the obstetric side, whether there is something which they have done in terms of some risk factor is there in terms of external cephalic version, etc. And whether abruption also could lead on to some amount of fetal-maternal hemorrhage. In MOMO twins, monochorionic monoamniotic twins, there will be kind of definitely feto to fetal and feto-maternal hemorrhage both happening at the same time. In placental chorioangioma, there will be both feto-maternal hemorrhage as well as some amount of microangiopathic hemolytic anemia which happens. So these are some of the risk factors which we need to consider, and depending on how much of bleed has happened over what duration of time is very important. As Dr. Siddharth was mentioning, if it is a chronic bleed which is happening over a period of time, then it will be kind of microcytic hypochromic picture. Whereas if it is an acute bleed, the baby can really present with shock state, which will not respond except when you are giving a bolus. The resuscitation will be tough. We might have to give O negative transfusion in the delivery suite itself. Reduced fetal movement and abnormal heart pattern. If it is a chronic anemia, they can present with fetal hydrops, IUGR, etc. So this will make us suspect fetal-maternal hemorrhage. How to go about it? Next slide, please. Basically, it depends on what is the period in which fetal-maternal hemorrhage is suspected. Is a period would the baby's lung maturity be enough to deliver the baby, or should we wait? So we have to see the well-being of the fetus in terms of doing an ultrasound, doing a growth, biophysical profile, Doppler velocity of the MCA, again seeing whether there is a increased flow, and flow cytometry and Kleehard-Betke. As Dr. Tarani said, Kleehard-Betke is a simple test, acid dilution, with the principle that the fetal cells are very resistant to acid and showing up as pink cells against a background of ghost maternal cells. Once the diagnosis is confirmed, as I said, delivery, immediate newborn care and transfusing the baby, or are we going to prolong the pregnancy by doing intrauterine transfusion and waiting for lung maturity to happen? So it depends on the gestational age with which we are suspecting fetal-maternal hemorrhage. And also a point which is very important is many of the stillbirth, one of the investigations, unexpected stillbirth, one of the investigations which has to be included would be sending a cord blood for hemoglobin and also doing a Kleehard-Betke in the mother, looking for fetal-maternal hemorrhage. So except that this mother has not presented to us with reduced fetal movement, we would have lost this baby entirely. Coming to the Kleehard-Betke test, I think one can go through the literature how much percentage of fetal cells would equal to how much of blood loss. So if our baby has a blood loss of 3%, if fetal cells present in Kleehard-Betke in the maternal blood cell is 3%, then the amount of fetal blood loss would range somewhere from 100 ml to 150 ml.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Revati ma'am, do you want to add anything?
No, I think she covered everything, but sometimes when you see a pale newborn and there's not enough time to investigate, it's best to presume that this is a feto-maternal bleed and treat as such and go ahead with the resuscitation. And these are babies that will benefit from immediate transfusion. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. So for the fellows, you can identify this condition. You can see a mass in the ultrasound, which is also vascular, and a gross picture of the condition is also shown. So we'll go to the next case.
And also, I'd like to add that any baby where we are seeing an increasing lactate, there is always a benefit of transfusion. Even in the studies that said restricted transfusion, they gave increasing lactate as one indication where it's better to transfuse the babies than restrict transfusion.
Thank you, ma'am. So I know we are running very late, so we'll wind up with this case. So Dr. Balaji.
Yeah, this is a term baby with normal perinatal transition. Mother had a MTP at 9 weeks of gestation because of poor fetal cardiac activity. The baby was breastfed and was gaining appropriate weight. The baby was noticed to have lethargy and poor feeding on day 28 of life. On examination, the baby was not icteric. There was no hepatosplenomegaly. Investigation done showed hemoglobin of 7.5 with MCV of 101 with normal WBC count and platelets. Retic count was 1.2%. DCT was negative. Peripheral smear showed low RBC count with macrocytic, normocytic RBCs with normal WBC and platelet distribution. Bilirubin, RFT, LFT, all of are normal. Blood group of the mother and baby are both O positive.
So I think the differentials that we can discuss here with this baby who had presented late in the end of 4th week of life with anemia. So Dr. Uma, can you take up this?
Yeah, the baby presented basically with lethargy and poor feeding. So I would put sepsis across as my first possibility, with metabolic etiology as a second possibility. And if you see the blood picture, can you go back one slide? If you see the blood picture, it is showing a hemoglobin of 7.5 grams, which can very well happen in a sepsis as well. If the sepsis is excluded, and if we think that the lethargy and the poor feeding is because of the anemia, anemia which is manifesting as cardiac, causing hemodynamic instability. So the hemoglobin here is 7.5 grams with a very low retic count of 1.2%, with macrocytic normochromic peripheral smear picture. So maybe I would consider, after ruling out sepsis and metabolic, in terms of hypoplastic anemia, could be a TARCH infection, even though it is a little bit late. Usually we see little earlier. So again, I also would consider possibility of inherited disorders, RBC, like pure red cell aplasia in this condition, because all the other cell lines seems to be intact, with only red cells being affected. If all the other cell lines are also affected, maybe we should think, as Dr. Siddharth mentioned, we should think in terms of marrow infiltrative disorders like leukemia, and also congenital dyserythropoietic anemia.
Thank you, ma'am. So, Revati ma'am, can you let us know, I mean, when will you consider a bone marrow aspiration biopsy in a child?
I think here this baby's history is and clinical findings are very beautifully illustrated here. For the degree of anemia, he's not producing the retic response. So for HB of 7, the retic count is low. That itself is telling that there's something wrong with the marrow. So I would go back, ask what is the birth weight, and examine for features of any mid-facial defects to see whether this could be diamond black fun. Look at the heart and look at all the somatic features. The most important hallmark will be that they won't be organomegaly. So if they have any hypoplastic marrow, they won't have an enlarged liver or spleen. Even in all these torch babies, you will see a small liver or spleen enlargement or some tissue infiltration, but if it is a diamond black fun, they will have no organomegaly. So if at this point, would I do a marrow? Probably not, because it would say we would have ruled out torch and sepsis and everything, and transfuse the baby and ask them to come back in 4 to 6 weeks time, because if it was some transient event, they're going to get better. And maybe in 8 weeks time, if in 4 weeks time, when the baby is about 8 weeks old, still the retic response is low and the HB is falling despite what we've done, then definitely do a marrow at that point. Because practically doing a marrow in a 4-week old baby is scary. That bone is so tiny, and what would we do at this point? We would transfuse. It's not that we can offer any medication to correct the anemia. So provided the family is somebody that understands what we are trying to do. Yeah. But if we have to be scientific, definitely a tibial aspirate is indicated.
Agree, ma'am. Thank
Dr.
you.
Tharani, I just have one point to add. Yeah, I agree with ma'am. And as we have been discussing in the whole of the panel, I think NGS also has a role in case if we are strongly thinking in terms of hyperplastic anemias, instead of having an invasive bone marrow, there is like we could even adopt NGS, which is non-invasive, and it involves, if the parents are affordable, it involves only a blood test, and we can have a NGS and then reverse phenotyping to see in case if we are getting a VUS, variant of uncertain significance, we can always do a reverse phenotyping and go back to marrow, because marrow, as ma'am said, is very invasive and very scary in newborn period.
Agree, ma'am. So as rightly pointed out, the retic response is more in feature of hypoproduction syndrome. So it was a case of Diamond-Blackfan anemia. So we skipped this major and supporting criteria. And Dr. Siddharth, can you take up from here as to what are, or how do you manage here, and how do you quickly about how do we differentiate whether from a transient cause like a TEC?
Yeah, so just once, I just beg to differ slightly from Dr. Uma. Diamond-Blackfan anemia is one condition where the genetic diagnosis might not always be, we have still not unraveled the entire genetic profile of Diamond-Blackfan anemia, number one. Some of the patients we have still not found the mutations. So bone marrow still is usually the modality retic count bone marrow, and sometimes an elevated HbF, which is often not practically helpful, is how we diagnose. Yeah. But of course, we should try to get NGS for the antenatal counseling whenever possible. Now, treatment-wise, steroids are supposed to be effective in 80% of the cases, but for a baby, especially in the neonatal concept, giving steroids is going to profoundly affect the neurocognitive development. So textbooks usually encourage to avoid steroids and give transitional therapy till they're at least 6 months of age and then start steroids. But having said that, if I'm seeing a very poor family where giving regular transfusion is going to be difficult, I have started steroids even in babies as small as 2 months of age. So you have to see the profile of the family also. And of course, a curative treatment is transplant. Even though they respond to steroids, around some of them may lose. It will be difficult to attain a consistent response and may lose the remission series once you stop the steroids. So BMT is always an option.
Thank you. So the bone marrow erythroid hypoplasia as shown, and as ma'am pointed out, dysmorphic features should be looked for definitely, and this is the classical triphalangeal term seen in these children with DBA. So the other hypoproliferative anemias, as was already discussed, could be a CDA, sideroblastic anemia, and infections. We should definitely look into it. And the TEC is also a possibility, of course, later in life, and we need to differentiate between DBA and TEC. So
if I may just add with the CDA, one hallmark clue will be retic will be low, but LDH will be disproportionately high because there's intramedullary death of red blood cells. So when you see a very high LDH, there is a hemolytic picture, but the retic response is low, then think of CDA, and that would be a clue. But the main thing is that with DBA, counseling is tough because, as Siddharth said, transplant is the curative option. But we have so many follow-up, 15-year follow-up, and some children till 2-3 years they need transfusion, then suddenly they go into spontaneous remission. So it's very difficult to say which one will need a transplant, which one won't. So I would in this group do only transplant counseling once they have crossed the first 3 to 5 years. They are requiring regular transfusion. The family is committed because it's difficult to jump in and say that you will be a long-term transfusion dependent. Sometimes they'll respond to steroids, then after that won't need steroids also, and just maintain a hemoglobin of 8 to 9. So it's a very variable clinical spectrum in Diamond Blackfan, and these are actually the most difficult children to counsel, because we don't know which way they would progress once you've made a diagnosis with a gene mutation. So I've had some now who's 21-year-old who's just been on 2.5 milligrams of prednisolone for all these 18 years.
Thank you, ma'am. That's definitely taken. So, I just quickly brushed up. So this was a near-term baby who had presented with bilateral retinal bleeds and multiple ecchymotic patches as shown here within 24 hours of life. And as we see here, the
Dani, may I
hemoglobin
request you to wind up, and then because we have to go the quiz also what you have given. So it's we can't leave students without the quiz things, and people are logging off.
Sure,
Just
I
completely
agree.
quick.
I agree. I think you should give the quiz answers because this is quite an extensive case on its own. Yeah.
Sure. So it was just an interesting case of protein C deficiency with, microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. So I skipped this part. I'm sorry. And again, this is one of the quiz questions that fellows can take it up. So in a child with a severe RH isoimmunization and hemolysis, if we see these skin spots, what we think of. So with this, the quiz questions are over. So I'd like to finalize saying that significant variation should in the size, shape, osmotic resistance should be interpreted properly, and the developmental erythropoiesis has to be understood properly to arrive at a diagnosis in a given scenario. And of course, as Dr. Siddharth mentioned, systematic approach with good clinical history, examination, and stepwise investigations are the keys to appropriate diagnosis and management. So I come to the answers for the quiz. So which blood group antigen doesn't initiate an immune hemolytic anemia in newborns? It's actually the Lewis blood group because it's absent in fetal RBCs. The second question is which minor blood group incompatibility suppresses fetal erythropoiesis? It's actually KEL antibodies. They are second next to RH antibody, RH group, which has the immunization potential because it has the capacity to destroy the erythroid precursors. The simple delivery room procedure, of course, you would have got it right. So it is delayed cord clamping. And the findings shown in the above picture was the Haynes bodies. We see the supravital staining on the right side of the picture. It can be seen in unstable hemoglobins, G6PD deficiency, and alpha thalassemia. This interesting picture in the case of context of fetal-maternal hemorrhage, where mass with increased vascularity was a placental chorioangioma, which can present with polyhydramnias, IUGR, and fetal-maternal hemorrhage. So the smear that is shown here is a pycnocyte, multiple spiny projections in the RBCs, which are seen, which can be seen in infantile pycnocytosis and multiple enzyme deficiencies or drug-induced hemolysis in a newborn. And this is a classic picture of intradermal erythropoiesis, which may happen robust in a child who is actively hemolyzing due to a RH incompatibility. So with this, I thank the organizers and the panelists to have had a wonderful session. I'm sorry really about the technical hitches that happened in between. Over to you, Sunil.
Dharni, thank you very much. I think it was a lovely session. I really enjoyed it, and it was quite interesting also, especially to hear the other perspective from a neonatology point of view. So Dr. Oma, we appreciate your contribution and your thought processes in some of the case scenarios which were discussed. So with that, we conclude, and I think it was Dharni, you did a good thing by putting these questions. In fact, this was how we had conceived it before, and we kept on requesting, in fact, the previous moderators, please send us questions. We can really make a proper, questionnaire to be posed, maybe before the session and maybe after the session. So that's how we had initially conceived it. But unfortunately, we don't get these in advance, so we couldn't really do it. So in future, if any of the moderators feel that they have to do a questionnaire, it can be sent to us few days in advance. We can then, have a proper the form created for that. So thank you, Dr. Revati ma'am. We appreciate your time as well. I think you have been probably the most attended and as well as contributed to these sessions. Siddharth, it was a lovely session from your side. I think you put the whole process, diagnostic algorithm very nicely. And Balaji for compiling all these cases, I think is a good case collection you had. So thank you, Ria, for conducting these, and Echo for especially for giving us a platform. And we'll see you next Thursday with another interesting topic and discussion on that. Thank you very much.
Hats off to Dharani to have traversed the less travel path and done so well. Thank you.
So well. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Oma, for sparing your time.
I should thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity and entry into the hematology field. I really enjoyed Revati ma'am. I really enjoyed, and Siddharth sir. Thank you.
I think you should say the other way around. We love coming into the newborn unit and looking at those little babies. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dharani. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.